Well, hello there, everyone. It is so fun to watch you coming on from all around the world. We're so glad you're here. If we haven't met, my name is Carolyn Arends. I am Renovaré's Director of Education, and it brings me great joy to welcome you to this Renovaré webinar, which we're calling Shaped by Shame. How do we receive the grace that can transform us? Let's get to our panelists. We are really excited to be able to access their wisdom. Really been praying about the ways we think they're going to be able to help us with this question of shame. So let me first introduce you to Dr. Curt Thompson. Curt is a psychiatrist who integrates an understanding of interpersonal neurobiology with a Christian view of what it means to be human. Dr. Thompson helps folks through a variety of platforms, including workshops and speaking engagements, organizational consulting, and private clinical practice. And I'm sure many of you know Curt through his podcast, which is called Being Known, and through his books, which include Anatomy of the Soul, which came out in 2010, The Soul of Desire came out in 2021, and then a brand new book called The Deepest Place just came out a few months ago. And then out of those books, while everything Curt has written touches in some way on the problem of shame in human formation, will most likely be referencing his 2015 book, the book, The Soul of Shame, retelling the stories we believe about ourselves. So, Curt, you're joining us from your home office just outside Washington, D.C., and we're so grateful that you're here. Thanks for doing this.
Carolyn, thank you so much. It's just the whole the notion that I'm with this Renovaré community means a great deal to me. I grew up in an evangelical Quaker community, and Richard Foster was the speaker at my college baccalaureate, and so I just have great affection for and a deep sense of connection. So really grateful to be able to be here, and especially to be able to have a conversation with you and my friend Ken.
Awesome. Didn't know that about your background, and it sounds like we're overdue for this. So thank you so much.
Yes, indeed.
You mentioned your friend Ken. Ken Shigematsu, of course, is our second panelist after a corporate career in Japan. Ken transitioned into pastoral ministry. I said that wrong. Somebody's been telling me on our staff, it's not pastoral, it's pastoral. There we go. Unless you're in a country church, then it could be pastoral ministry. Anyways, Ken has been in pastoral ministry since 1996. He's been the senior pastor at 10th Avenue Alliance, which is one of the largest and most diverse city center churches in Canada. Ken's books include, from 2013, God in My Everything, which is one of the most helpful books I know of about crafting a rule or rhythm of life. His 2018 book, Survival Guide for the Soul, and then his brand new book, Now I Become Myself, How Deep Grace Heals Our Shame and Restores Our True Self. Pastor Shigematsu is joining us today from his church in Vancouver, BC, Canada, actually just down the road, not too far from me. Thanks so much for doing this, Ken.
Yeah, you bet, Carolyn. It's a pleasure. And I, too, have been impacted by Renovaré, the teachings of Richard Foster and Dallas Willard. And it's great to connect with Curt. We've had some interactions before, but it's an honor to be in conversation with Curt and with you, Carolyn.
Yeah. I'm so excited about this conversation. We got the most number of registrants for this webinar we've had for any Renovaré webinar, which I think really speaks to how this topic, even when people don't know quite even what it is, they have this sense that shame is somehow affecting their formation as a human being, their flourishing as a human being, their connection with God and with other people. And so let's start with, we got so many questions just asking for definitions. What is shame? Is it good? Is it bad? I mean, we could spend the next 6 hours talking about that. But for each of you, do you have sort of a working definition of what it is you're talking about when you talk about shame? Curt, maybe I'll ask you first.
Sure, and it's a completely reasonable question, and I think my response typically is I don't actually think of it in terms of having a definition as much as it has a description. We know, we would describe that we have a sense of what it is when it's happening to us. And it involves a number of things. That first and foremost is consistent with the way the body works. It is a neurophysiologic event before it is anything else for us. We sense it, and only then do we make sense of it. And then it has other elements of it, kind of neurophysiologically. It is what we call disintegrative. It tends to separate my capacity to think from my capacity to feel and sense and image in a coherent whole. It interrupts my capacity to create, because so much of what I'm trying to do is just survive the onslaught of the sensation itself. And so it leads to, once I'm disconnected, it leads to me turning away and isolating. It leads toward my eventual stasis neurophysiologically. I'm static, I don't move. Creatively, cognitively, it's hard for me to do that. I certainly don't move toward another person. I move away from another person, but then remain static. And then there are some cognitive elements of it. The cognitive element that's most prominent is that of contempt or condemnation. When I have thoughts that are related to this neurophysiologic response, that's telling me things primarily about myself, but also things that I think that you think about me. And the last thing is that we would say that it is this very primal harbinger of abandonment. It is this sense that I don't just feel bad. It is I feel bad and no one will want to have anything to do with me. Now, we use language to describe that, but that too is a much more deeply felt thing. And in all of that, we would say this all comes because shame is a primitive affective state. We can experience this as early as 15 to 18 months of age, long before we have language. And so we are well practiced at it by the time we get to the 3 or 4 years of age. And obviously, as a human race, we're well practiced at it, which is part of how it is that we see it in the very first pages of the Bible.
Fascinating. All right, Ken, how does the way you think about shame, is it similar? Is it different? How would you talk about shame?
I think it's similar to what Curt is saying. I just describe it maybe a little bit differently. So I define shame as a painful feeling of not being enough or being deficient in some way. Sometimes that's a conscious feeling. Sometimes it's unconscious or subconscious. So I have a dream occasionally that I'm tapped on the shoulder and I'm asked to give a sermon or a speech. And I have no idea what to say. So I get a piece of paper, scratch out a little outline. So hopefully I'll be coherent. And I stand up before the group. I look down at my notes and all I see are symbols like the number sign, an exclamation mark, a question mark, the number 2. And then people start standing up and walking out of the auditorium. And so I think that dream is signaling that I have a fear of not being enough, of being deficient in some way. So that's an indication of the shame that I have. In terms of other ways it manifests itself, if we experience shame, as Curt was saying, we tend to either shrink back and go small, or I'm still here. We try and go big, but for the wrong reasons, in order to validate ourselves, in order to prove that we are worthy.
I'm all of a sudden understanding a number of dreams, a number of recurring dreams that I have that are quite similar. Okay, so 2 very helpful lenses in. Would you make any sort of categorical distinction between shame and guilt? Ken, can you talk about that?
Yeah, guilt tends to be an emotion that we have, a feeling that comes up when we realize that we have missed some kind of standard, that we've fallen short in some way. So it relates to maybe a rule or a principle that we violated. Whereas shame is more related to our identity, how we feel about ourselves, whether we are worthy or not, or deficient. And shame also is more relational in that it relates to how we see ourselves and how we perceive others seeing us.
So sometimes you'll hear people say, guilt is over something I've done, shame is over something I am. Is that an oversimplification in your lexicon, or Is that helpful?
Yeah,
Okay.
I would generally agree with that, but the emotions tend to be so similar that sometimes it's hard to distinguish guilt and shame. There's a lot of overlap.
Yeah. Curt, how about you? How do you think about those
Yeah,
two
I
categories?
think this is where developmental neuroscience can actually be helpful for us in that, as I mentioned earlier, shame is this phenomenon that emerges on
We have a glitch with Curt, I think. Ken, is it happening for you as well?
typically.
I can sort of hear Curt muffled. He's back.
Yeah, sorry, Curt, you glitched for us. You said
Okay, sorry.
you would, yeah, go a couple
Yeah.
sentences back.
Yeah, so shame, yeah, shame comes on very early. I don't need language for this. The thing that we call guilt is something that typically most researchers would say doesn't start to show up in children until they're somewhere between the ages of about 3 and 5 years of age.
Hmm.
And this is related to, it's generally considered to be related to the notion of prefrontal cortex development, in which moving from 18 months of age to 5 years of age, I now have a sense that there's other people in the world besides me. I don't have that at 15 months of age. I also have the sense that there is a thing, to Ken's point, there's a thing that I've done, right? I did something bad. There is a thing that I've done that is separate from me, but the thing that I've done has also hurt a relationship that I have with somebody else. In other words, I haven't just done something wrong. I've done something wrong according to somebody else's standards, whether it's my parent, my teacher, my this, my that, whatever this, there is this relational capacity that I now have that sees me as separate from the other person. But what's also really intriguing about this, not only the maturation of the brain, so is this, and this is research that's been done in elementary school and high school kids and college students and other adults. When you, if you have an experience that we call guilt that takes place, if you do something that where there's a fracture, where there's a rupture between you and someone with whom you have a significant relationship, a person who matters to you. The thing that we call guilt, when I experience that, I will tend to move toward that person in order to resolve this. I will want to tend to move toward them. I still have agency to move toward them, to say I'm sorry, to ask them to forgive me, because there is this sense in which the guilt is moving me in that direction as a way of resolution. So I still have agency. With shame, I do not tend to move towards someone else. I tend to move away from someone else. I do not look at you, right? Dogs do this, right? I don't look at you. I need someone to come for me in my shame. In the early goings, I will not tend to move towards someone else. And this is where the gospel is such a big deal. So much of the texts that we read about that talk about sin also attach this to shame, this sense that I need somebody to come and find me, because I can't do this on my own. This gets back to the immobilization that shame tends to impose upon us. And so we say, you can do something and you hurt somebody's feelings and you ask for forgiveness and they say, great, you repair the rupture and it's great. And then the next day you wake up and you remember it and you still feel something. And we would say, what you are now feeling is not guilt. This is shame. You can have shame without guilt, but if you have guilt, you can be assured that it's built on a hard deck of shame. And so shame becomes this thing also that is so much more gnarly in terms of our resolving it from a neurobiological standpoint, and the actual neural networks that are involved in how it emerges and is formed, which is partly why it takes such a long time for us to contend with it over time.
Fascinating. So this, between what I've done and what I am, and also maybe one of the ways we can tell what's going on is it pushing me towards someone or away from someone? Have I lost my agency? Guilt, I'll still have some agency. Shame, I'll have lost it. Really interesting. Do you think, Curt, that our capacity for shame is part of our God-given design?
Well, it would appear that shame shows up in Genesis chapter 3. It shows up. And it seems like, oh, this was part of the inbuilt created response to things that people do. When these things happen, this is what's built in the same way that there's an inflammatory response in response to an infectious agent. Like this this happens. And one of the questions that we're considering here today is like, is there good shame or bad shame and so forth? And again, I don't know that that's, at least in my mind, that those are words that I use to describe it. The question is, what's the intention behind it? That shame is primarily a signal that's telling, it's a flare going up. It's telling us that something's happening in the system that is not okay. And the question then becomes, what do I do? What's my response to it? The first couple couldn't wait for God to, they were going to go hide. I got to hide myself. I'm going to hide myself. And so the question becomes, shame is a signal that is telling me that there's a problem. What am I doing? Most of what is problematic about shame isn't so much about the neurophysiological response itself. Most of it is about what I then do in response to it, and what we do as a community in response to it. Are we willing to go and find the other in the same way that Jesus has come to find us? When we know that shame is filling the room, am I willing to be with that person long enough for them to see that like their shame is not going to keep me from them?
Mm-hmm. Ken, how do you think about this? Is shame, I'll ask the same question. Do you think shame was innately given to us by God, and then it is somehow twisted at times? How do you think about these? Would you have categories of healthy shame and toxic shame? How do you think about it?
I feel that, along with Curt, that shame is a God-given capacity. So, for example, I'm thinking of a friend of mine who worked for a very famous company for an exceptionally famous CEO who everyone would recognize. And so I was just curious, and I asked him, what was it like to work for this CEO? What was his management style like? And my friend said, well, he would just walk into a room where we were working and tell us how terrible our work was. And then he just started swearing at us, cussing us out, and then he'd walk out. That was his management style. And so it seemed to me that this CEO had no capacity for healthy shame. Healthy shame can act like a proximity sensor in a car, where if we sense that we're going to collide in a violent way with someone that is not going to be redemptive, we can steer away from that. If we're tempted to, swear at someone or cuss someone out gratuitously and can imagine the shame that we would feel afterwards, that it can be helpful in that it'll curb our behavior. I think that shame on a temporary basis, what I describe as state shame, can be redemptive and helpful. But when it becomes a trait, a part of our identity, where we feel we haven't just engaged in a non-helpful interaction that is alienating people, but when we start to feel that we are fundamentally flawed and deficient, and it becomes part of our identity, that's when shame becomes toxic.
Really helpful. Yeah, so you're both sort of talking about in terms of a signal or a sensor, and then what do we do with it? How do we respond to it? And how entrenched does that? I feel like that state shame. So state shame, you say, Ken, is the more temporary. And then what's your word for the habitual shame?
Trait shame.
Trait shame.
Trait shame. So state is temporary, but shame as a trait is longer lasting.
Right.
It starts to form our identity.
Okay. So when you say that you're doing a webinar about shame, I would say most people end up writing questions about whatever your categories are, about getting trapped in that cycle of trait shame, to use Ken's language, or in a feeling of never being able to move out and away from this, never being able to receive forgiveness from God or from anyone else, and that sense of alienation that you talk about, Curt. A lot of people talked about this connection to childhood. Is that typically where a cycle like that begins, Curt, in your experience?
Well, again, I think we are not just anthropologically, but even individually, we've been at this for a long time, because it begins as early as 15 to 18 months of age. And it begins pre-verbally. So we are already finding ways to experience it and then having to manage it long before we know what's going on. And so we've developed some kind of set of skill sets, and we have, and depending upon the families in which we grow up, there are some families that will grow up in, if you grow up in a family where fairly healthy, secure attachment is what a person's experience is, you will find that shame, of course, is something that's going to be experienced in the family. But what you will also notice is that family members are naming it. And we're wading into it, and we're saying, oh, this is what this is, and we don't want you to continue to remain in that. So I love that, Ken, this difference between state and trait, because we're all going to experience it. The question is, in what way do we respond? And in what way do the people around us enable us to navigate that over time? When we grow up in families where insecure attachment, and especially where toxic attachment processes or trauma takes place, shame is the primary affective state that is governing so much of that. And especially when you're young and your neuroplastic freedom is just all over the place, like you just said, we just practice, the brain really quite easily encodes this to the point where we just have lots of real estate durably formed into this trait of shame that Ken is talking about. So that by the time we're, in late teenage years, early adulthood, we find ourselves responding out of that space with all of the narrative that we bring to it, with all the story, with all the movies that are, playing in our mind. And then, of course, it's virtually impossible for us to separate my embodied experience in my family, in my school, and so forth from what I experience God to be. So if this is what I'm experiencing most of the time, just because I hear something different from the pulpit is not necessarily going to make it easier for my brain to shift gears if I'm going home and most of the time of my life is spent doing something very different. And so we like to say that, we become what we pay attention to. And if I'm paying attention to states of shame, even non-consciously, over and over and over and over again, I will find that so much of my life is governed by it, even without my being aware that that is one of the primary forces that's in charge of it. Until, of course, I reach some point where my brain says, I can't keep doing this. And that's when we will start to have other signals, right? We will start to, our anxiety and our panic events and our depression and all the other things, our drinking too much, our pornography, all the things that we are doing to try to keep it at bay because it is no longer willing to be kept silent.
And what have you noticed about the connection between kind of the way we're raised and our experience of trait shame? I would think I specifically want to ask you about that in family systems, but also culturally, because I know you address coming from a shame-based culture, and a lot of people had questions about that as well. So I'll give you a twofer there. How does the way we're raised and formed affect our experience of shame?
Yeah, I come from an Asian culture originally. I'm from Japan. Moved to Canada when I was fairly young. But when I was a teenager, I got into the bad habit of shoplifting. I was also doing some small-time drug dealing and joyriding. I got caught shoplifting. And I remember how my dad and my mom brought me into my room, made me kneel sort of Asian style, which was very painful because I wasn't flexible then, and I'm not flexible now. And I remember my parents telling me how I had brought shame not only on myself, but on the family. And so if you're raised in a more communal culture, you realize that your actions not only impact you, but your family or your clan. Some people grow up in families where they're expected to go to a great school, to pursue a prestigious career. And if they don't get admitted to a great school, or if they don't end up working in a prestigious job, they can feel a lot of shame around that. And so, as Curt was saying, the family environment certainly shapes our identity and the way we experience shame.
Yeah. So I want to get to, as soon as possible, to how can we respond when we're experiencing these things? What kind of practices and orientations can open us up to grace? But just before I get there, I feel like there's probably lots of people with kids in their lives watching this call, or maybe pastors, shepherds of congregations saying, how do I call my people to flourishing, right relationship lives without kind of, inadvertently creating a culture of toxic shame where they're just going to spiral. One person had asked a question about shame is such an important parenting tool. Like how do I parent my children well? How do I lead people well without using shame in damaging ways? Curt, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think as we were saying before, shame is a signal, and shame as a developmental reality is necessary for us. We need to be able to respond to that. And for the most part, and also I tell parents all the time, look, the only way that you're not going to screw up your kid is don't have them. It's the only way that you don't. And we are going to in our parenting efforts, there will be moments when we will, through our tone of voice, through our intention, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to overstep. We're going to end up, using shame when we don't intend to. All those things will happen. The real question will be when, if and when I'm recognizing that as a parent that I've overstepped that, and I've kind of teetered into the territory where the shame is now being used in a toxic fashion, where I'm using shame as the primary disciplinary method. That's the primary methodology. My kid's going to sense this. My kid's going to sense my intention. And if my intention is, if my intention is I want my child to, to develop a healthy way of living in the world, if shame becomes the primary driving force of that, what can happen is that we tangle up shame with intimacy. And this is where things get really complicated, really difficult for us, because now intimacy becomes a thing that I'm not really sure that I want much of because of how much shame gets tangled up with it. The real key is that when shame actually shows up in a parenting situation in which I don't want it to be so, the most effective thing for us to do is to go back to our kid and to repair the rupture and to say, what happened between us yesterday? I know that you felt ashamed, and some of that was because of what you did, because it's true that there are human behaviors for which the absolute proper response is to be ashamed. We're not nearly as ashamed of things as we should be in a lot of respects these days. The question again, though, is what do we do in response to it? Once shame has our attention, right? For most kids, for instance, when they become ashamed, I don't have to help that. The shame is going to do its job. Then the question becomes, how do I help you, my child, respond to this signal that has gotten your attention? How do I help you respond to that? And if I have overstepped my use of shame, if I've overindulged in that, I want to go back and say, I want to own my role in that and repair that rupture, but not because you shouldn't feel ashamed at all about your behavior, but because I don't want to pile on when that's not necessary. And so we would say for all of our parents, God is not worried about shame happening in the house. God is concerned about what we do in response to it, how we name it, how we instruct our kids, how we talk with our kids about that using developmentally appropriate language that they can handle and understand, and so forth and so on.
Really helpful. Ken, things you would add to that?
Yeah, I would just say, and this may sound fairly basic, but when we parent our children, it's so vital that we reflect something of the unconditional love of God to them, and that will foster a sense of security. And when we challenge them, that'll be better received. So that's really key. And then Curt was talking about rupture and repair. We're going to have rupture. That's going to be inevitable, but we can always move toward repair. We won't be perfect in avoiding rupture, but we can be nearly perfect in seeking repair and reconciliation when the relationship feels severed in some way.
And I one last thing too on this, Carolyn. I would say culturally, part of the challenge for us, and Ken, I would love your take on this as a pastor of a large flock, and for leaders who are in our audience today, not just of churches, but leaders of organizations and companies and so forth. There is a sense in which, we have, whether explicitly or implicitly, we've kind of come to this place where we are like, we have this allergic reaction to shame. Like we can't let anybody be shamed. Like, no, we do everything possible, even as parents, to not make sure that our kids don't feel it. We want to protect everybody from having, and it's like doing something that keeps that keeps my inflammatory response process in the body from happening. Like I don't like it, but it's necessary to protect my body from infecting agents. I don't like that kind of a response, but it's necessary for me. And so in some respects, part of the work that we have to do, even in our organizations as leaders, is we ourselves, I would want to know, well, who's coming for the leaders, such that the leaders are comfortable with shame as a thing that they're dealing with. And when I say comfortable with it, I don't mean that they enjoy it or they like it or they're using it as a weapon, but we recognize, oh, there are elements of my life for which I sense this, and now what am I going to do in response to it that does not leave me alone, so that knowing that I can do this, I'm also going to be unafraid of seeing where shame shows up when I'm having a conversation with an employee for whom shame might actually be one of the responses that would be necessary for them to feel. Not that we're trying to foist it or hammer them with it, but we're not trying to avoid it either. In order for us then to take the next step of asking, well, what do we want to do from here? And to Ken's point about this loving kindness, my literal embodied posture in this space where you're feeling shame, I want to provide for you an embodied posture that is myself not going to become uncomfortable with that, but I'm going to remain with you while we together help you discern what your next steps are going to be in response to this shame that you may actually be feeling in a proper fashion.
Really helpful. Okay, so let's get to what do I do when I experience shame? And let me ask it first on a shame is still functioning as a helpful signal. I've done something and it's proper for me to feel some shame. Even just theologically and relationally, let's talk about that for a minute, and then we'll talk about what should I do when I realize it's become an entrenched spiral that no matter how many times I ask for forgiveness, I can't break out of. So first of all, I've done something wrong. I realize I've hurt someone. I've sinned against myself or God or others or creation in some way. What is the most healthy way I can respond when I get that signal? Ken?
Sure. So it's healthy just to be able to recognize the feeling of shame and to name it. When we name a painful emotion, whether it's shame or whether it's resentment or envy, if we were to do a brain scan on you, the scan would show that the emotion actually calms, that it quiets. And in terms of if we're carrying a heavy load of shame or guilt, the last thing we may want to do is to confess that to someone else. But in the scriptures, we're told, confess your sins, not just to God, James 5:16, but also to one another. So in my book, Now I Become Myself, I share a kind of embarrassing story about way back when I was a student. I was on a summer trip and had this summer fling. She was in a relationship with someone else. I was planning to initiate a dating relationship with someone back home. So a romance was really out of bounds. But one night we met up on a sidewalk and we spontaneously started kissing. People may say, that's not such a big deal. But I felt that I had violated my code and conscience. And so I felt both guilt and shame. It was heavy on me. And then I had an opportunity to talk with a Christian friend of mine whom I trusted, a mentor figure. I confessed what I did. My friend was disappointed, even teared up a little bit. But then he said, I love you, Ken. And he pronounced God's forgiveness over me. And I felt a huge burden fall off my back. And when we can name our shame in the presence of another and we're received in love, and the person says, I'm not going anywhere, or welcome to the human race, there's something about that helps to break the cycle of shame. And it also reveals God's space to us, God's love to us.
Mm, mm. Well, Ken, I love that. I love your description of your friend who, if I heard you right, even became tearful in that space. There was a time for some of our listeners. You may remember a time when um, you heard the phrase "just say no to drugs." And one of the things that we remind people of is that the part of the brain that hears the phrase "just say no to drugs" has nothing to do with the part of the brain that wants to do the drugs.
Mhm.
And what we're getting at here is this notion that shame is, because of how it is initially, it is a neurophysiologic event. It doesn't begin as a cognitive, its impact is a felt, sensed phenomenon. Consequently, you can tell me things. You can say to me, Curt, you don't need to be ashamed. If I'm in Ken's position, and I'm wanting to reorient, I'm wanting to repair a rupture, you can tell me something. And words are important, but they're not sufficient, because the primary way that I'm going to have a different experience of shame, especially when it's toxic, is when my body comes to sense a certain sense of relief in in the presence of another. So Ken, when you talk about the face of God and the voice of your friend, like this notion that it is a real human being that is signaling to you this sense of hospitality, essentially, that you, with your story and all that you feel, are welcome in my presence. I want to be in the room with you. And this is the beginning of how, whether this is a state element of shame or it's a trait element of shame, the healing of that begins, as we like to say, the brain operates bottom to top and right to left, right? That I sense, and then I make sense of what I sense. And when it comes to this healing process, I'm first going to sense it in brain time, in nano to microseconds. I'm first going to sense it, and then we'll have to make sense of it and practice that over and over again in order for it to be changed.
So helpful. Yeah. So two things are really jumping out to me. One is whenever I notice shame is having actually even a healthy effect, but especially an unhealthy effect, move towards relationship, towards God, towards someone I can trust. And the other thing is like embodying when I repent of something, embodying my experience of forgiveness. So we just had a Renovaré Institute retreat last week, and we wrote things down that we were carrying and left them at the cross. It's like this, so that our bodies could feel what we were doing. Or I've heard of people carrying a heavy rock all day that represents something that they wish they had never done, and then laying it down so that your body begins to experience this. So maybe we could move into when shame has become a trait, when it only is separating us from God, it's not moving us into repentance and connection and other people. What else would you guys suggest in terms of some first steps, some practices, some things to try? Ken, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, it can be helpful if shame has become a trait to go to some of the people who know you best. They may be family members, friends, people in your community, and ask them to describe who you are. We can't form our sense of identity independently. We're shaped by the views of others, how they name us. And so to be named and to hear how others see us, I think that can be a helpful first step. And then to spend time in silence, in God's presence, and to invite, this may sound very abstract and very ethereal, but to invite God to name us, to describe who we are, and to be receptive to God's love for us. And we know what God says of us in Scripture. I learned this practice from Curt, or this particular way of praying. So in the mornings, I tend to be very easily distracted, like 132 monkeys jumping around in my head. So I'll spend some time simply breathing deeply in through my nose,
Mm.
exhaling slowly, and just centering and rooting myself in the presence of God, breathing in deeply, exhaling slowly. And at the end of this time of prayer, I will imagine God the Father saying over me the words he said over Jesus at his baptism. Ken, you are my beloved son. In you I am well pleased. I'll repeat it. Ken, you are my beloved son. In you I am well pleased. I'll repeat it a third time. Ken, you are my beloved son. In you I am well pleased. And so it deepens the affirmation. Some people may say, well, does God love us as much as he loved his unique son, Jesus? Jesus said, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. And so we are loved in a way that by Jesus that mirrors God's love for him. And so I just take time to sort of sit in a sense of God's love for me. Curt has said, it only takes 2 or 3 seconds for shame to form in your brain, but it takes 30 to 90 seconds for affirmation to form. So you've got to sit with it, open up your heart, and then savor God's affirmation and the affirmation.
Yeah, that's just really moving, Ken. I appreciate that. I think it's a living, breathing example of in the soul of shame. This sounds kind of sterile, but basically Hebrews 12:1-2 provides a framework whereby which we can begin to respond to shame. This whole notion that it begins with a cloud of witnesses. And so we ask the question, who are the people, and not in the abstract, not who are just in my head, but who are the people with whom I am present on a regularly cadenced basis, once a week, by whom I'm being deeply seen, soothed, safe, secure, where I'm making a practice of bringing all these parts of me that carry all this payload of shame into the room. So this notion of, therefore, we have such a great cloud of witnesses, and since we do, we're going to throw off all the sin. So one of the parts of this exercise of addressing shame is we need to identify things that we are doing that are actively propagating and perpetuating the shame. Because we come to find out that we're actually one of the primary culprits in the shame that we carry, because we are the ones who continue to tell the stories about ourselves in our head without recognizing that I am my own worst accuser. I'm agreeing with the accuser. So I have to say no to all kinds of things to prepare myself to do the next step of, I'm going to focus my vision. I'm going to watch what Jesus does, right? I'm fixing my eyes on him. So to Ken's point, Jesus lived a life in which he's doing a lot of work, listening to the voice of God saying, you're my son, whom I love. You're my son, whom I love. And imagine what it would be like in the course of our day if Jesus were walking around with you everywhere you went, and everything that you're doing in your best moments, your worst moments, and he looks at you, puts his hand on your shoulders, like, I'm so glad to be in the room with you. And there'll be plenty of moments when I'd be looking around and thinking, like, I don't know what, like, I think you're on something, because I don't know what you're talking about being in the room with me, because I've got these other thoughts that are banging around in my head. But we're asked to focus our eyes, as Ken is talking about, like fixing our eyes on Jesus. This takes practice. Watching what he does, doing what he does. You're my son whom I love. Listening to this, practicing this over and over again. And then this whole notion of his journeying to the cross, that he did not avoid the shame, right? He went after it. He went to where it was. We have an exercise for patients, and it's what we call a shame inventory, which of course is not a very fun thing to do. But you take a 3x5 card, and I say, anytime you sense, image, feel, think, or have an embodied impulse that represents shame, I just want you to make a mark on the card. Because what evil wants you to do is to go down the rabbit hole with all the cognition of all the, to Ken's point of, like, I'm not enough, I'm not okay here and there, and all of the various parts of the movie that we're playing. What I want to do is simply interrupt that process neurologically, neurobiologically, the neural networks. I want to stop the process. So I just want you to make a note on the card. I remember having a patient that came to me after this assignment. He said, look, I have a full-time job. I don't have, like, by 10 o'clock, I had filled up both sides of 1 3x5 card. I don't have time to keep doing it because it's just everywhere. And the
Mm.
point is, once we stop in that moment, I don't want to figure out why I've thought this, where my shame has come from. I just need to turn my attention to you're my son, you're my daughter, whom I love. I'm going to practice sensing this, imaging this, feeling this. But I'm also going to practice naming these things on a regular basis in a context of a community, a cloud of witnesses that by whom I'm being deeply seen. And I'm going to do the same thing for them, in which we develop a habit. I mean, this is right in the spirit of Renovaré. We are developing spiritual practices in which it is common for us to come and put our shame in the middle of the room in order for it to be healed, in order for it to be reimagined, in order for the story of my life that is associated with it to begin to be imagined differently than through the entangled, lens of shame. And I can't do this by simply making myself do this in my head. I have to have an embodied experience of this with other people in the room. And, we say, look, if you were to be standing on the sidewalk and you're approached by a little red wagon at walking speed of about 3 miles an hour, it would be strange, but there it comes, and you would stick your foot out and you would just stop it because that's all it would take. If you're standing on a railroad track and you're being approached by a locomotive at 3 miles an hour, you couldn't stop it, but not because of its velocity. It's its mass effect. And shame is the neural equivalent of a locomotive. And what we need to do is build a bigger train. And the cloud of witnesses, the community with whom we practice the body of Jesus, becomes the way that we say no to that. I don't say no to my shame. We say no to my shame. We say no to your shame that is toxic in order for our attention to be turned to you are my daughter, you are my son, and I have beautiful, good things for you to create with me. Let's go do this.
Wow. This is so helpful. And I just had the first thought in my head I've ever had that Jesus in some way experienced shame, the signal that you're talking about, which means, because there were a lot of questions where there was concern of like, if we are trying to mitigate shame, we're not taking sin seriously. But we're starting to separate those things out. Sometimes shame is the result of sin, but sometimes it's the result of being human in a brutal world. Is what I'm starting to see. Yeah, and so what Christ did for us on the cross, it not only sort of resolves the sin problem, but also the relationship problem of
That's right.
of being able to be connected first with Father, Son, and Spirit, and then with each other in a way that begins to mitigate the unhelpful ways that signal sounds off in our bodies. Really, really helpful. There's so much I want to ask you, and the clock is going so fast. Here's one thing I want to ask you for sure. So, at Renovaré, we really do encourage people to make use of spiritual practices as ways we can open ourselves up to, the practices themselves don't do anything except allow us to place ourselves before God in his company so we can open ourselves up so we can he can transform us, heal us, connect with us, make us whole and holy. Are there spiritual practices? This is a question we've been asking a lot the last few years as people become more trauma informed and more aware of the toxic effects of shame. Are there certain spiritual practices we shouldn't do until some of this trait shame is resolved? How do you guys think about that? Ken, have you thought about that at all?
Practices that we should not do?
Yeah.
Should avoid. So I pray something called the Litany of Humility pretty regularly. It's by Thomas à Kempis. And so I will pray from the desire to be honored, Jesus, deliver me. From the desire to be loved, Jesus, deliver me. From the desire to be esteemed, Jesus, deliver me. And if a person is really struggling with trait shame, that may not be a particularly helpful prayer. They might need to instead pray from my disbelief of being loved. Jesus,
Right.
deliver me. From my shame and self-doubt, Jesus, deliver me.
Yeah, that's helpful. Curt, does anything come to mind for you?
It's a good question, Carolyn, and I think I think for me, I think that the primary mitigating factor in all of these things, whether we're talking about particular practices or other things, the primary mitigating factor for me is the question of who are the other people that are involved in my story. We like to say, in the Soul of Shame, we talk about how, there is this thing called shame. It is a phenomenon, but that takes up residence within the context of the story that I'm telling about my life, which is crucially important to recognize that we're telling a story. Like we like to say in Genesis 3, shame isn't spoken about explicitly. We infer it by what we read in the text. And what we see is that shame is actually wielded by the serpent in the very conversation that he has with the woman, such that shame is actually in play in the story long before any fruit gets eaten, which is important. It's wielded as a weapon. It's indirect, it's subtle, because this is how evil operates. But what this means is that when it comes to spiritual practices, for example, I would say, well, if I'm choosing any of those, so Ken, the one that Ken just mentioned, for example, I would trust that whoever we're talking about, and whoever's listening in our audience, I would be wanting to know, who are the people with whom you are choosing to practice this with? Who are the people that you're in relationship with, where you're having conversation with, so that you can say, when I practice this particular exercise, I start to sense something and feel something. And so that other people can help me respond to that in a way. And so I think so to Ken's point, some of this is going to be, we'll make our decisions about these practices depending upon in what way, when I enter into a practice, do I start to sense, image, feel, think these kinds of shame things coming on? And am I able to name that and the story that I'm telling about it with someone who's in my cloud of witnesses who can be curious with me about, what part of your story that is still entangled with so much shame, what part of your story is now coming into the room? And let's talk about that so that we can, so that in fact, the attempt to practice that spiritual practice may be a door that is now opening to this part of my story that I didn't know that was in play, and actually becomes a way for me to experience healing in the presence of this cloud of witnesses, eventually to go back to that practice little by little by little, so that I'm doing this not on my own, so that I have a checklist of things that I can or can't do, but so that I have a community that is enabling me to figure this out along the way together.
Really good. We have this expression where we say you do practices as you can, not as you can't.
Yeah,
And
that's great.
Right?
That's great.
It solves a lot of these dilemmas.
Yeah.
And that the litmus test of a practice is it producing more love in my life? And in all the directions. Am I more aware of God's love for me? Am I more able to love him and others? And if it's not, like if I am just like a world champion faster, but it's not producing love in my life, it isn't doing
you should eat more.
Yeah.
You should definitely eat more.
Let me get to a few of these questions that have come in while we've been talking. Nina asks an important one, and I think it will help us get at another thing that will be important for you guys to address. Nina says, what if the shame is from something done to a person, for example, sexual abuse? It's not actually their fault, but becomes trait shame. And this feels like an important question to me, because there were a lot of questions about repressed memories. If I become aware, if I start to realize, there's things that I've been repressing for my own safety, should I go in and dig those out? Can you address some of these, like this connection between trauma and shame, repressed memories, and egregious things done against a person? What would be some steps, and maybe we'll throw to you first, Curt, and then over to Ken. If I become aware that something that was done to me of a serious nature is feeding this spiral of shame.
Right. Well, I think one of the first things that's important to recognize is that we when you go back to the second page of the Bible, you read a comment that is germane for everything that follows after that, and that is that it's not good for the man to be alone. And the whole notion of being alone in our trauma, I mean, this is one of the primary ways in which trauma is actually traumatic, is that we experience something and then we are in isolation with not just the trauma, we're in isolation with ourselves. I'm in isolation, not just with the thing that has happened to me, but with the story that I'm telling about myself, about the thing that has happened to me. And that isolation is what strengthens the trauma. It strengthens the experience of shame that I have. And, we're becoming increasingly trauma informed. And so more and more, the whole notion of God with us, that notion, we become increasingly aware of just how big a deal that is, because so much of our trauma represents the parts of me about which no one is with. I am isolated and alone with it. And so at first we would say the very nature of people becoming increasingly comfortable with allowing others to come close, whether that's in therapy, whether that's with a pastor, whoever that's with, it's coming close. And of course, this is what feels uncomfortable, because intimacy is the context in which my trauma and shame have taken up residence. It is the very thing that I most desperately long for, and it is also simultaneously the thing that I'm most terrified of. And so I tell people, it's like if you had a near drowning event as a 4-year-old in the pool, but now all your friends in your mid-20s are having pool parties and they want you to come, you might not want to do that. And so you're only going to be able to do that if your friends meet you in the parking lot and gradually introduce you little by little by little by little by little back into that space, because they want you to be with them. This is how we fundamentally treat trauma. And so once we are able to allow ourselves to have others be present with us little by little, so that we can begin to name the things, but do so in the context of community, which is what enables us to name the things, be present, and learn to regulate our affect and so forth, which often can take days, weeks, months, years. That gives us greater capacity to get into deeper and deeper parts of the pool over time. And one of the things that we will recognize eventually, when we are able to tolerate ourselves, not just the trauma, is that we will begin to recognize that it's not just the thing that happened to me that is the reason that I'm where I am. It is also because of the things that I have done in response to this, the stories that I have told, the actions that I have taken, all the things that I have done, that I'm now going to also have to identify and take responsibility for, not in a shaming way, not in a condemning way, but in a way of just acknowledging the mechanics of how I have reinforced my shame by virtue of my own behavior. By me choosing not to go to the pool, I relieve myself of my distress, and I also confirm that I am not able to be at the pool. I tell myself, I am the one who frightens myself more than anything. It's no longer the near drowning event. It's me. But in order for me to get to a place where I can begin to name those things, I still have to have plenty of practice with someone being with me in that terrifying place to let me know that I'm not by myself, so that I can begin to regulate those emotional states that are so painful. And as we are doing that whole work in the absence of shame, we come to find how much a role that it has played in all of this. And eventually, in its absence, the toxic nature of it, we find ways to move forward into healing and community.
Anything you'd add to that, Ken?
Yeah, when someone, I think you mentioned, is assaulted or sexually assaulted, they may take responsibility that they shouldn't, but they do, or they feel like they're damaged in some way. I'm thinking of someone I know who experienced a great deal of shame and then led to an eating disorder, which in her case was a symptom of her desire to disappear. when she was 18, she went to see a therapist, and she was all curled up like a ball, hugging her knees, gazing at the floor. And this was her posture for the first several sessions. Then, because God's presence came to her through the loving presence of the therapist, one day she was able to straighten her leg, and the therapist mentioned, "You straighten your leg." And then on another session, she was actually able to speak and to find her voice. And in time, through the loving presence of the therapist and God's presence through caring friends, she experienced gradual healing. So as Curt was saying, don't do this alone, but do this with another, a friend, a therapist, a pastor, spiritual director.
Yeah, this leads me to Sarah has submitted a question, and she says, are you saying we can heal from shame with ordinary others, or do we need an expert? And I think that's a great question, and I would want to reframe it to you. There'll be a lot of spiritual directors on this call, pastors, parents, teachers, people who deal with people who are struggling with shame. When do you refer? So Curt, you'd be the one that people would refer to, but Ken, if you've got someone from your congregation, where do you think, we need some professional therapeutic support here alongside things that I can help this person with? As a caregiver, where is that line for you guys, or what would you suggest? Ken, how do you think about that?
Yeah, first of all, in terms of connecting with friends versus a quote professional, there have been a lot of studies done on this. I think Curt can probably cite some of them, where it's clear that if you're talking to a wise, trusted person, that can be just as beneficial as talking to a professional counselor or a psychiatrist. If the person needs medication, however, a layperson can't prescribe that. They need to talk to a physician or a psychiatrist. So that would be one case. And then if the problem seems so intractable for the person listening, whether they're a pastor or in some other role, then it would be certainly appropriate and desirable to refer them to a professional counselor or physician or someone who could give expert advice.
Ken, I love that. I love your framing of that. I think, one of the things when we're training clinicians in our practice, and when I am training clinicians in other practices, what I say, look, at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is to become people of wisdom. That's really what we're trying to do. So all the things that we do in a psychotherapy consultation room, I mean, there are certain mechanical things that we do that you might not do in your kitchen, right? We're practicing EMDR and IFS and a range of different things. And there are certain somatic interventions that you come to see a physician for. There's no question that some of those are absolutely necessary for people's healing. It's true. At the same time, the vast majority of what's happening in the psychotherapy consultation room is happening in our kitchens and at the checkout line in Safeway and on the highway. What's different about the psychotherapy room is that we're just being explicit about all the things that are taking place. This is what we're doing. And what we're doing is we're trying to name what's happening in the room in order for people to make wise choices and to do so in a wise way. And so when it comes to trauma, what we're really trying to do is to be present for people on an ongoing basis. And we're saying, we're going to be here, we're not leaving the room. And there are lots of ways in which that is really the expression of wisdom. Loving kindness, a presence of loving kindness is the fundamental element of psychotherapy, of pastoral work. And so there are ways in which, yes, I think we can get to places where referring somebody to a therapist is absolutely necessary, crucial, can be helpful in ways. In the same way that, at some point you send them to the surgeon if they got to have their gallbladder taken out. That's what we do. At the same time, I think that there are probably ways, if we are willing to do our own work, even if we're willing to allow ourselves to be immersed in the text, immersed in prayer, immersed in the Spirit, immersed in community, where we're doing this kind of revealing work, we become agents of healing for others in ways that we otherwise might not be. So I think the question is not just so much like, well, do they need a therapist or a friend? But the question would be, in what way could I, as a friend, be more like a therapist than I thought I could be?
Mm.
In what way can I become increasingly more and more a resource of wisdom? And not just because of all the wit and wisdom that I have, all the information that I give you, or trying to fix your problem, but my willingness to, with curiosity and without condemnation, be present in the room and ask the questions of where are you and what's the suffering like and all the things. These are things that wisdom are about, and certainly there are certain tactics and practices that we conduct in the psychotherapy room that are maybe that are unique. But my sense is that God takes us far more seriously than we take ourselves,
Mm.
and including if it is true that someday we are going to rule over angels, as St. Paul writes. If that's actually true, I'm thinking, crap. I don't know. Where am I going to get the management graduate degree to do that? I don't know how I'm
To
supposed to
reign
do
with
that.
Christ. Mm-hmm.
But if this is the case, then we are being called to practice for that heaven that is coming, and to practice developing the wisdom that will be necessary for us to live in that world, and that can be practiced here and now as we are friends for those who need us to be outposts of goodness for them.
Mm. So helpful. One thing I'm seeing in the questions and comments is pain out of recognizing when someone recognizes they need community, they need to experience grace and connection with another human being. But in the past, when they've tried that, it's only led to more wounding. So I'm seeing that quite a bit. Or like, I just cannot think, a person is saying, I just cannot think of a single person I could trust with what I'm carrying. I first just kind of want to acknowledge the heartache of that, and then just ask if you would have a word for someone who feels they're in that position. Ken?
Yeah, it's always a huge risk to reach out to someone. Relationships seeking to establish connection can lead to heartache, but it's in relationship where our deepest joy occurs, where our most profound healing happens, where we sense most meaning in life. So even though it is scary, it's worth the risk to pursue that relationship, whether it's with a friend, potential friend, or with someone in a professional role, a therapist, a counselor, a spiritual director, a pastor.
Yeah.
It's funny, Carolyn. I imagine Jesus walking into the room and meeting with one of our listeners who's genuinely wrestling with this question. I can imagine him walking in the room, and the first thing he would say would be like, "Oh my gosh, you too."
Mm.
I'm so glad you're saying this, because I feel like you know exactly what it's like for me to be me.
Mm.
I went around Galilee and I had all kinds of people I asked to come with me, and they were like, this one dude, like he had to go like check out land that he'd purchased, which of course sounded kind of weird, like that seemed a little backwards. And then other people had to go bury their dad, and other people like, I'm like, shouldn't you already be doing that? And then with Abraham, like I could have given you the list of 70 people who I tried to get to go to Canaan with me, and finally I come upon this guy named Abraham, and he finally said yes. Like I had all kinds of people. And so, I mean, we know from the scriptures that God is a God who, like, once you get past the second or third page of the Bible, there's virtually nothing that he does that does not involve other humans.
Mm.
And he knows exactly what it's like to want to have people join him in an enterprise like this. And we say no. And so much so that, like, we'll even kill it. I mean, that's how much we don't want to do this. And so to that person, I would want to say, first of all, this is really hard. This is really hard. And it's not hard because you're a pansy or because you're weak or because you're not working hard enough. It feels hard and frightening because bad things have happened to you.
Mm.
And then I would say, and there is no other way. And therefore, I want you to think of one person who you would like you wish they would be willing to consider like sharing stories with you about your life. I want you to try one person. And this is not denying how frightening it is, how hard it is. In fact, we're going to say, yep, it's frightening. Yep, it's hard. And this is the way that we do this. And we want you to know that if you eventually, with prayer and perseverance, we really do believe that we're going to find somebody who's going to want to do this, no matter how much it costs me, because otherwise your option is to remain where you are. And that would be an option that I would imagine isn't going to be one you want to pick.
Mm. And if you reach out and that experiment fails, you have further identity with Christ. You talk to him about it, and then you try again.
And we try again.
I feel like I hear you saying. Yeah, with someone else.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Wow. You guys, time is up. This has been so rich. It's gone by so quickly. In a minute, I'm going to ask Ken to pray a blessing over us. We really commend, we've just scratched the surface of the help you guys provide in your books. So we really, really will make sure we send out a resource page with links. Any final word either of you would want to offer, something you wish we could have said? Curt, any final word for you?
Well, I'll just say this again. First of all, I know, I mean, Ken and I haven't had an opportunity to yet drink tea or coffee together, but I'm just really thrilled in that this experience that we've had right here and now is one more way that Jesus even comes to me today. Because I know, Ken, you're a guy. You're somebody who's getting after it. You're somebody who's doing the hard work. And that is encouraging to me, to be in the room with someone who's doing the hard work, because I don't feel so alone in doing the hard work. And with that in mind, I want to say, the news about shame, I tell people, the news about shame is far worse than we know. And it is far better than we can imagine because of Jesus.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Ken, any final word from you before you pray for us?
Yeah, I would say for each person to know that whether you feel it or not, you are loved perfectly by Jesus, by your Maker. And John tells us that perfect love casts out fear, including the fear of rejection, which is at the core of shame. And so if you, by the grace of God, can open yourself more and more to that perfect love, you'll find yourself on the road to freedom and becoming your truest self as you radiate God's image into the world.
Thank you. Ken, will you pray for us?
Sure. Lord, as Curt has said, we thank you that everything that you do involves people, that you want to be intimately involved in our lives. And so I pray for all those that are viewing this or will watch in the future, that you would come to them in all of your love, compassion, joy, and grace. We pray that people would be able to receive your love and to find healing and wholeness and liberation from shame. I pray that you would bless people, that you would keep them, that you would cause your face to shine upon us, that you would be gracious to us, that you would lift up your countenance toward us and grant us your peace, your wholeness, your shalom. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
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 And Curt, can't thank you enough. Everyone who joined us, thank you so much for opening up your heart to this conversation. It will be really exciting to see what Jesus does with this opening. So thank you, friends, so much.
Wendy, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Curt.
Thank you.
Everyone, for joining us.
So much.
Thank you.
Indeed.
See you guys.